Today we're talking with Michaela Hoenicke Moore, who is currently a fellow in residence, so to speak, at the Obermann Center. And Michaela is also an associate professor in history. And Michaela, it would be wonderful if you could just begin by telling us about the book project that you're currently working on during this semester.
Yes, gladly. And thank you for having me, Jennifer. So I'm working this semester and before and after, hopefully, on a project that is my second book that is tentatively entitled The Varieties of American Patriotism, how Americans debated their country's role in the world. And I look at foreign policy views at the grassroots level, basically. And my time frame is, since I'm a historian, from World War II through Vietnam. The years actually start with the Munich crisis, the so-called Munich crisis in 1938 through 1975. And what led me to this project, which I currently do, and I want to mention briefly sort of what the source base is in a moment, but what led me to that is that I became a diplomatic historian, a US diplomatic historian, a historian of American foreign relations via a detour that is sort of biographical and really important to me. I was born and raised in Germany, and I think I became a historian, and I was technically a historian of Nazi Germany and the Holocaust before I did US diplomatic history, but I became a historian of American foreign relations. I became a historian because the question of Nazi Germany, so basically the question of how the Weimar Republic and a liberal democracy disintegrated into fascism and war and genocide, was one that was palpable to me as a child and as a student, you know, in high school and so on. And that led me to sort of go down that path. And my first book was about how Americans understood Nazi Germany, and that brings in the foreign policy component, because I looked at Americans at all levels of society and government and Hollywood productions and conferences of psychologists and anthropologists towards the end of the war on how to deal with Nazi Germany and also Japan. And that topic sort of World War II and how Americans understood Nazism at the time stayed with me and led me to the current one of how Americans, ordinary Americans, think about their country's military interventionism and global leadership and so on, because I discovered a kind of stereo and dual vision as a German immigrant in this country, in the sense that I think I sort of, like many people, feel a deep sense of gratitude and appreciation that Americans joined the Allies to defeat Nazi Germany and liberate Europe from Nazi terror. And then with reading letters from ordinary Americans, I gained a deeper and deeper appreciation of how much resistance and skepticism there was at the time of doing that, because Americans on the farms in Iowa and in the big cities on both coasts and all across in the South, in the North, felt like we have already done that a generation before under a democratic president who promised to wage this war as one to end all wars and to make the world safe for democracy, and that didn't pan out. So why do we have to do it a second time in the same place, you know, in Europe? So it was this ambivalence that I myself feel that led me to sort of dig deeper into what did actually ordinary Americans think about this and how did they compute this.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned what kind of resources that
Right.
you're relying on.
So in my field, public opinion and foreign policy, it's really dominated by political scientists,
Mm-hmm.
and I heavily draw on their work, which in turn is based on qualitative sources, namely polls and surveys, which really get going and become reliable in this period of the 30s and 40s, and then become more and more sophisticated to this day and more detailed. And I complement those sources with qualitative sources. So especially for these decades, the mid-century decades from the 30s through the early 70s, Americans were a letter writing people. Like, I mean, any scholar who has worked on that writes about that, but until you have seen it, you know, the millions and millions of letters and folders that just burst out of presidential libraries, it's categorized as public mail there, but that are also in the archives in state archives and local archives. For example, at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill is the Sam Ervin, the famous North Carolina senator who did the Watergate hearings, but also Vietnam War hearings. And there are just millions of letters in his collection alone where his constituency wrote to him about the Vietnam War. So it's a great source base because these letters are between 1 page to 10 pages. There is, for example, a marked shift between Roosevelt, people addressing Franklin Roosevelt as president, to Truman. So no one would ever have written to Roosevelt with his first name, whereas there are many letters directed at Dear Harry, sort of with a sense of, we know that you need all the help you can get. You yourself said so. So, you know, here are my views on what's going on in Korea and so on, or, you know, with the Soviet Union. And people really lay out in great detail how their appreciation and thinking and sort of critique, approval of often, you know, what they heard on the radio, what they saw on TV, what's printed in their newspaper about major foreign policy decision and major international events, how that fits in.
Mm-hmm.
There are recurring themes, for example, for farmers that I'm very alert to because of the state in which we live, where mothers and fathers write and say, you know, I cannot afford to have my only son, or, you know, our third son also be drafted, you know, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
So everything fits into larger and more complex individual lives. And people actually thought a lot about international connections and relations and events. So this trope that we had for a long time, that Americans are tuned out and isolationist and not interested, is not at all true when you look at these letters.
Mm-hmm. So we were talking a little bit earlier about what, I mean, we're all spending so much time, you know, with the news and various kinds of news sources. But some of the things that you're hearing coming out of both American political leaders, perhaps political leaders from other countries, but that is resonating and echoing with these earlier periods that you're studying right now for your book. And you gave a few examples, if you could share those.
Yeah. So I think, as for all of us, and with our different fields of expertise, my mind is flooded. You know, this reminds me of that, and here is this connection. So one thing that I wanted to comment on is the war analogy. I noticed it myself, as I'm sure all of us did, but many of my colleagues already have started commenting on it, you know, in the media and elsewhere. And I was just interested to see my own sort of development over the last few weeks about war analogy. So my first gut instinct as a scholar is that it's very problematic, because it reduces our nation and our country every time it is deployed to, this is what we're best at. We're best at war. So let's just organize ourselves as if we were at war,
Mm-hmm.
and then we can conquer this. And my problem with that is, as I write a whole book about how multilateral, cooperative, and pacifist-minded Americans are, generation after generation, I really try to pull them out from underneath the wreckage of this foreign policy discourse of the last 70 years, that our global leadership means military interventions, or that is an important staple of it and part of it, and that the one thing that we're best at, our primacy in the world, really for 70 years was based on that idea, economic and military. Of course, as a historian of US foreign relations, a little bit sarcastically, I also want to say, and when exactly was the last time that we won one of these wars? But more to the point, I think it's not true about this country. It's not true about the achievements of Americans, our national achievements. There are so many things that we're good at and that Americans have pulled off. So don't reduce this to that this is our finest hour when we go to war. It is just simply not true. Then there is a kind of sub-point to that, which is some of the more specific rhetoric that we hear from the president and others as well, that we are fighting an invisible enemy, as others have pointed out, that has long and deep and problematic roots in our history. It ties in with a pathologizing and racializing of enemies, sometimes imaginary enemies, and sometimes sort of the government declares this to be an enemy, and now we all have to marshal our resources against that. Invisible enemy is always an anti-Semitic trope. It's always a nativist trope. I just last night and coincidentally found a quote by Herbert Hoover, where he accuses the New Deal president Franklin Roosevelt, as he did for years and years and years. He asked, I don't really know whether Roosevelt is a fascist or a communist, and it doesn't really matter because either way it's un-American. The New Deal is un-American. And then the next sentence uses the Z's. It's a European disease, whether it's fascism or communism. I couldn't really tell you what the difference is. And of course, Hoover knew very well what the difference was. I can't really tell you what the difference is. It's a European disease, and through this president, it's entering sort of our national bloodstream. So that is problematic. On the other hand, since I'm a little bit hung up on that FDR Herbert Hoover dichotomy in the 30s and 40s, I often use it in my teaching because these are sort of two famous Iowans. Henry Wallace, on the one hand, the vice president, who really encompasses the New Deal's, embodies the New Deal spirit, and then Herbert Hoover, the previous president, who was a New Deal and FDR critic. I was also reminded in thinking about that the war analogy, like that very term, refers to Franklin Delano Roosevelt's use of it in his inaugural address, where he said in 1933, as he becomes president, we have to move as if one army facing the same enemy. And the next sentence is, and I will arrogate powers so that we can do this. So this is actually where the war analogy starts, that in the middle of a severe economic crisis, which this global pandemic will result in, has already, and it will only get worse, I will be like a military dictator. And Roosevelt was really encouraged to do that by experts across the partisan spectrum, Republicans as well as Democrats. So Walter Lippmann, for example, writes to him just before, a few weeks before this inaugural address, and says, Franklin, I think the situation requires that you act like a dictator. And then he does it, and he says, well, he does not act like a dictator, but he says, I'm going to use powers, sort of executive power. And then his wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, writes in her journal that night, I was a little bit frightened to hear that this line got the most applause of the entire inaugural address. But overall, sort of this was welcome. Mm-hmm. And I'm a huge FDR fan, so I look back and I think he was right, and this country really lucked out because he was not a dictator, and instead he gave us Social Security, and then he led the country, into war against the fascist power. So it's all really great. And then I have to think back to 1940, the third presidential election. So Roosevelt stands for an unprecedented third term, and the Republicans run with the slogan, Third Reich, Third International, Third Term. So Third Reich, the reference to Nazi Germany, Third International, a reference to international Bolshevism, the Soviet Union, soon to be our ally, and Third Term, the dictatorship that Roosevelt is about to perpetrate on this democracy. So it captures the Republicans and Hoover's spirit of, I don't know whether it's Nazism or communism, it's all the same, it's the New Deal, it's un-American. Mm-hmm. And I must say that I always had a real sense of appreciation for that Republican slogan, even though it was directed against my president, because that is really what characterizes a democracy, and you cannot have a democracy without partisanship, without another party, without contest, without competition. And so I think there is a time for national leadership and executive orders. Oh, as I say that, another one comes to my mind, which is Roosevelt's executive order to intern American citizens, Japanese Americans. Mm-hmm. I mean, huge mistake on the part of the White House and the executive, approved by Congress and upheld by the Supreme Court. So here you have a democracy, right? Fighting against racism and fascism abroad. And all three branches of government are, engaged in this act, which is deeply racist and problematic and dictatorial. Mm-hmm. So there's some some ambivalence in my own mind about these terms, about what is possible and what the best direction is. Yeah.
Well, and you were stating it before as this tension between foreign policy and democracy. And I think at the moment, what we're keep hearing about is the tension between public health, public well-being, and the economy, and financial well-being, and how slippery those can be, and that they're not as black and white as they can sometimes first appear. And you were talking about watching some of the protesters recently, and how some of that resonated with some of the letter writers that you've been studying. If you could just share some of your thoughts.
Yeah, actually, as you pose that question, sort of two different things come to mind. So let's start, with the protests and the letter writers. So one of the big insights and findings of my research thus far is that our urge and need to categorize is shown up as deeply problematic. It is as if scholars take their cues from the politicians. So these are Republicans, those are Democrats. These people are on the left, those people are on the right. These people voted and therefore are supporters and therefore 100% agree with X. These are isolationists, these are internationalists. These are religious people, these are atheists. The arguments that come out of these letters and sometimes oral history interviews are much more three-dimensional. And they stitch together something that we would categorize over here with something that for us is this other distinct category. Um, and and this is true throughout this entire period, you know, where we have hawks and doves for the Vietnam War and isolationist, internationalist, you know, and so on. So are you in favor of the Cold War or against it? Are you, you know, communist sympathizers? It's so much more complicated. And it just reminds me that we as scholars, or as just maybe as fellow citizens, should not take our cue from partisan labels and not even from expert labels, as in isolationist, internationalist, and so on. And I was reminded of that in tuning in a little bit more to what people had to say at these rallies that were presented, the anti-quarantine rallies that were presented as sort of pro-Trump rallies. And on the very surface, you know, in 3 seconds of sound clips, you could possibly hear that and make that out. But as soon as people were actually asked why they were there, what motivated them, what their reasons were for wanting to open the economy back up, I think what they said was very reasonable, was something that, you know, most of us can relate to. I kept thinking, as, you know, someone with family in Germany, the Germans are opening up the economy, you know, a little bit and locally. And I mean, eventually we have to, all of us have to, you know, it's just a question of how we proceed and so on. So that was one connection, these sort of hard categories, or maybe something from our political partisanship seeps into, you know, our, well, into two areas. One, our civic life, and one also our scholarly categories. It's just something that I have become quite aware of. And there is a second tension, and that I was just reminded of when you phrased that question, which is about, which also runs through my current research, so the tension between leadership and experts on the one hand, and sort of ordinary people and non-experts on the other hand. And in thinking this through recently, I could see so clearly that it's a tension that is also in my field between foreign policy, which should be conducted by experts, and where it's all about leadership and control, and democracy, on the other hand, which is always messy. You always have a cacophony. Maybe even in the way in which I presented the 40s and Herbert Hoover and FDR, there is an impulse that I find not only when I write about my beloved FDR and World War II and what I figured out and what everyone needs to understand, but in other areas as well. I figured this out, and this is the truth, and this was right, and that would have been better. And it's the prerogative of a scholar and maybe of a teacher. But in a democracy, you're going to have pushback. You're going to have, it's going to be at best a dialogue, but you're definitely going to have pushback, and people criticize it and say, no, for me, this is, you know, Roosevelt was on the verge of becoming a dictator, and, you know, there are all these mistakes that he made. And so there's always a greater complexity that actually does point to a greater truth that we can capture if we allow more voices into the debate.
Yeah. Oh, thank you so much. This was very interesting and great reminders for me. So I really appreciate your time, Michaela.
Thank you.